Behind the glamour of the harem lies a terrifying truth. A place where the Sultan's hands did not tremble to strangle his own son. Today, we uncover the bone-chilling history of the mute executioners of Topkapi Palace.
Chapter 11 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Your reader is Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haran and A. B. Poland. Chapter 11. Henry of Navarre, 1553 to 1610. In the year 1569, the Catholics of France and the Huguenots, or French Protestants, were engaged in a bitter and bloody war. Although religion played a great part in the war, it was really more of a political than a religious struggle. In the early summer of that year, the Catholics won a great victory near the town of Jarnac. Among those who fell in the battle was the great Protestant leader, Louis, Prince of Condé. The remnant of the Protestant army lay in camp near the castle of Cognac. They were sad and dispirited. Suddenly trumpets and drums were heard in the distance, and a sentry announced that a band of soldiers was approaching. It was soon learned that they were Huguenots, and the defeated Protestants were very glad to see them. They proved to be the escort of Jeanne d'Albert, Queen of Bern, a little kingdom in the extreme southwest of France. The people over whom she ruled were Protestants, and as soon as she heard of the death of Condé, she hastened to the Protestant camp. The army was drawn up to receive her. Stepping forward and holding her son by the hand, she said, "My friends, our cause has not died with the Prince of Condé. We have still left us brave captains. I offer to you as leader Condé's nephew, my son, the Prince of Navarre." With loud shouts of "Long live Henry, the Prince of Navarre!" the soldiers at once elected him as their commander-in-chief. Prince Henry was the son of Anthony of Bourbon and Queen Jeanne. He was born in 1553, and therefore was but 16 years old when called to fill this high position. He was too young to lead the troops in battle, but he was ready to learn how to do so. The brave Admiral Coligny agreed to instruct him, and to command the Protestant forces until he was able to do so. Henry was a sturdy and well-grown lad. His life had been a simple one. His principal food had been the brown bread, the chestnuts, and such other plain fare as was eaten by the peasant boys who lived among the mountains of his mother's kingdom. He would have been glad to go out to battle at once, but the wise Coligny would not permit him. Henry was very fond of reading. His favorite books were those containing the stories of the great conquerors of former times. He also read, many times over, the story of the good knight Bayard, the knight without fear and without reproach, who had lived not very long before. When not yet 20 years old, Henry was married to Margaret of Valois, sister of the King of France. It was hoped that this marriage would bring peace to the country. It failed to do so, and the war went on for 30 years. Only a few days after the wedding bells had rung so joyously at Henry's marriage, a very sad event took place which filled Europe with horror. At about 4 o'clock, one August morning, in the year 1572, the great bell on the Palace of Justice awakened the people of Paris, and the soldiers of the Catholic party began to attack the Huguenots. When news of this massacre reached other French cities, similar attacks were made, and a great many Protestants were slain. The number has been variously estimated, some authorities stating that about 1,000 in all were killed, others that the number reached 100,000. This was called the Massacre of St. Bartholomew, because it happened on St. Bartholomew's Day. The young Prince Henry was kept a prisoner in the king's palace for nearly 4 years. Then he escaped and again became the leader of the Huguenots. He was so anxious for the restoration of peace that he sent to the Duke of Guise, who commanded the Catholic army, this challenge: "I offer to end the quarrel. Either I will fight with you alone, or 2 on our side will fight with 2 on yours, or 10 with 10, or whatever number you please, so as to stop the shedding of blood and the misery of the poor." But the Duke would not accept the challenge, and the war went on. Henry III, King of France, was a very weak and foolish man, so the Duke of Guise determined to dethrone him and make himself king. As soon as King Henry learned of this, he sent an assassin to murder the Duke. When he heard that Guise was dead, the king said to his mother, who was very ill, How do you feel?" "Better," she answered. "So do I," said the king. "This morning I have become king of France again. The king of Paris is dead." The friends of the murdered duke at once took up arms against King Henry, and the Sorbonne, the great religious authority in Paris, declared that the people were no longer bound to obey him. Then Henry III turned for help to his cousin, Henry of Navarre. They agreed to fight side by side against those who had revolted, and many of the Catholics joined with the Huguenots in order to bring about peace. The rebels attacked King Henry near the city of Tours, but the Prince of Navarre marched to his aid, and the rebel leader left the field in great haste. As the rebels had failed to conquer the French king in battle, they determined to have him murdered. They found a man to carry out their plot. One morning, he gained admission to the king's presence by saying that he desired to see him on important business. As soon as they were left alone, the murderer handed Henry a letter, and while the king was reading it, he drew a knife from his sleeve and plunged it into his body. A messenger was sent in haste to tell Henry of Navarre. As he entered the king's room, the tears gushed from his eyes, and he kissed the dying man with a great tenderness. Many of the nobility of France had, by this time, come in to see their dying ruler. King Henry begged them to acknowledge Henry of Navarre as his lawful successor, and all present agreed to do so. So the Prince of Navarre became King of France, with the title of Henry IV. The rebels were not satisfied with this arrangement, since the law of the kingdom declared that no man could be king unless he were a Catholic. They demanded that Cardinal de Bourbon, Henry's uncle, should be made king with the title of Charles I. Preparations were made for a great battle near the town of Arques. During the night, the forces of the new king had dug trenches and thrown up earthworks, so as to give them a greater advantage over the enemy. Next morning, a rebel sentry, who had been captured during the night, was brought before him. As they talked together, the man said, "We are about to attack you with 30,000 foot and 10,000 horse. Where are your forces?" "Oh," said the king, "you do not see them all. You do not count the good God and the good right, but they are ever with me." A bloody battle followed, in which the king gained a wonderful victory. Soon after this he was joined by a body of English and Scotch soldiers sent him by Queen Elizabeth of England, and his army was thus increased to over 10,000 men. One day a carrier pigeon flew into the camp. It brought a strip of paper enclosed in a quill. On the paper were written the words, "Come, come, come." The king at once understood that he was needed at Paris, for that city was now in the hands of the rebels. He therefore hastened to its relief. The king was not yet prepared to capture Paris, but he attacked many other cities, and about 20 of them opened their gates and received him as their sovereign. Then followed the famous Battle of Ivry, in which the cannon, the colors, and nearly all the supplies of the rebels fell into the king's hands. On the rebel side, the loss in killed, wounded, and captured was over 11,000, while the king lost but 500 men. Very soon after the Battle of Ivry, Cardinal de Bourbon died, and about the same time the king laid siege to Paris, which was still in the hands of the enemy. Before closing up all the avenues of approach to Paris, he wrote a letter to the governor of the city, in which he said, "I am anxious for peace. I love my city of Paris. She is my eldest daughter, and I wish to do her more favors than she asks." But it was all in vain, and the siege went on. King Henry's army prevented the carrying of food into the city, and the people soon began to suffer. Bread gave out, and the people were glad to eat rats, cats, dogs, horses, or anything else they could find to prevent starvation. King Henry allowed the women and children to leave the city. He even permitted supplies to pass through his lines to relieve the besieged, saying, as he did so, "I do not wish to be king of the dead." But just as Paris was on the point of surrendering, the Duke of Parma, one of the ablest generals in the service of Philip II of Spain, arrived before Paris with a large Spanish army and compelled Henry to raise the siege. The king now felt that the only way in which he could give peace to his people was by uniting himself with the Catholic Church, and this he determined to do. At 8 o'clock on the morning of July 23, 1593, robed in white satin, he marched with a bodyguard of soldiers to the church of St. Denis, near Paris. At the door of the church he was met by a cardinal, an archbishop, 9 bishops, and a large number of clergy and monks. "Who are you?" asked the archbishop. "The king," replied Henry. "What do you wish?" was the Archbishop's next inquiry. To this the king replied, "To be received into the Catholic Church." Then the king knelt and declared his belief, after which the Archbishop forgave and then formally received him. After this ceremony, Henry was anointed at Chartres, and thus declared sovereign of the whole kingdom. Henry's great desire now was to make his people prosperous. He once said, "I wish every peasant in France to have a fowl in the pot every Sunday." To avoid as far as possible all further wars about religion, he signed and published the famous Edict of Nantes in 1595. The royal decree gave the Protestants equal rights with the Catholics. The government agreed to pay the salaries of their clergy as well as those of the Catholics. The Protestant children were allowed to enter the universities and colleges, their sick were received into the hospitals, and two great religious parties of the nation were placed upon a common footing. The last years of King Henry IV were years of peace and prosperity. The farmers and tradespeople were happy. The heavy debt which had lain for so many years upon France was entirely removed, and the taxes were reduced to a rate lower than ever before. In the midst of all this growing sense of security and comfort, all France was suddenly shocked and distressed beyond measure. A madman by the name of Ravaillac stabbed the king to the heart, and the career of the noble and generous Henry of Navarre was at an end. End of Chapter 11. Read by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Chapter 12 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Your reader is Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Horan and A. B. Poland. Chapter 12. Wallenstein, 1583 to 1634. A bloody religious war broke out in Germany in 1618, and as it lasted until 1648, it is called the 30 Years' War. This war was one of the most dreadful that ever raged in Europe. It was a struggle between the Catholic and Protestant parties, like that in France, which we have read about in the story of Henry of Navarre. Many Catholics and Protestants opposed each other because they wished to defend their belief, as well as to convert others to it. But many of the princes and nobles used the disturbed religious conditions to increase their power. Thus, religion and politics were closely united, and the lines were drawn between two great parties, the Catholic League and the Evangelical Union. Therefore, all through those 30 years, the Catholics and the Protestants of Germany strove with all their might to overcome and destroy one another. Of course, this great war required great leaders. The ablest general on the Catholic side was Albrecht von Wallenstein, who was born in Bohemia in 1583. His parents were Protestants. They died while he was yet a child, and he was brought up by an uncle who was a Catholic. The uncle sent him for his early education to the Jesuit college at Olmütz, and afterward to the universities of Bologna and Padua. While at the Jesuit college, Wallenstein became a Catholic, and this changed his whole career. Wallenstein inherited from his father a large estate and an immense sum of money. By his marriage with an aged widow, his wealth was nearly doubled, and when his uncle died and left him his property, Wallenstein became one of the richest men of his day. His aged wife did not live long after their marriage, and he took for his second wife a daughter of the Count of Harrach. By this second marriage his wealth was again increased, and through his wife's father he gained much influence and many friends at the court of Vienna. After completing his education, he traveled through Italy, Spain, France, and Holland. He served for a short time in Hungary in the army of the Emperor Rudolf, who was then at war with the Turks, but as yet he did not display any marked ability as a soldier. With a part of his wealth he purchased from the Emperor of Austria a vast territory in Bohemia and Moravia at a cost of over 7 million florins. To this territory he gave the name of Friedland, that is, Land of Peace. The emperor gave him the title of Duke of Friedland, and he managed his duchy wisely and well. Justice was so faithfully administered in the courts that all men had their rights, and the farmers, miners, and manufacturers were properly cared for. When the 30 Years' War broke out, Wallenstein raised a regiment of dragoons to aid the cause of the emperor. He was also the means of saving the money in the imperial treasury from falling into the hands of the enemy. As Wallenstein came more fully into notice, his ambition steadily increased. In all that he did, he seemed to have an eye to his own advantage. After the war had been going on for some time, the emperor found himself sorely in need of a better army. Then Wallenstein called upon him and said, "My liege, you shall have such an army as you require. I myself will bear the expense of equipping it. I make, however, this condition, that I shall have the right to compel the people in any part of the empire where my troops may be fighting to supply them with provisions." And to this condition the emperor agreed. Wallenstein soon made for himself a reputation as a great commander. There were plenty of men in Germany who were ready to fight for pay and plunder, and he therefore soon raised a force of over 30,000 soldiers. He himself went with them to the front. During the first 2 years, Wallenstein and his men were everywhere successful, but at length they met with a severe check. They had laid siege to a large commercial city called Stralsund. This was one of the wealthiest ports on the Baltic. It exported a great deal of grain and other produce, and vessels flying its flag were seen in every harbor of Europe. Wallenstein determined to capture Stralsund. His soldiers knew that if he succeeded, they would get a vast amount of plunder and an abundance of provisions for their future use. Wallenstein had more in mind than that. He planned to turn the merchant vessels of Stralsund into battleships, and thus secure a fleet which would enable him to carry on the war by sea as well as by land. He would then attack the other great ports of Germany, such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen. All these ports had large fleets of merchant ships. He planned that after taking these, he would make his navy the largest in the world. He even dreamed of capturing the ships of England, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and thus making himself master of the sea. It was with these thoughts in his mind that Wallenstein laid siege to the great port of Stralsund. He swore that he would capture it, even if he found it to be fastened to heaven with chains of gold. But Stralsund was well supplied with provisions, and, for 11 weeks, the brave citizens repelled his attacks. Wallenstein's men began to suffer for lack of food, and at last the great commander was forced to abandon the siege. Every year a festival of rejoicing is still held in Stralsund to commemorate the day on which Wallenstein and his starving army retreated, baffled and angry, from before its walls. Wallenstein had won so many victories that some of those who fought on his side had become jealous of him. As soon, therefore, as he met with this great reverse at Stralsund, his enemies persuaded the emperor to take the command of the army away from him. They made the emperor believe that he was a very dangerous man, and that with his large army, which had grown very fond of him, he meant to rule all Germany, and lord it over every prince and duke in the empire. The emperor at once wrote him a letter ordering him to give up his command. Although greatly surprised, Wallenstein took his dismissal in silence. He bade farewell to his troops, and went to live quietly in the capital of his duchy. Not long after Wallenstein had left the army, the emperor found that he had made a mistake. Instead of hearing of victory after victory, he now received news of one defeat after another. His second-best general was fatally wounded, and he had no one like Wallenstein to put in command of the army. After suffering a number of disastrous defeats, the emperor sent to Wallenstein and begged him to take command once more. He gave him permission to choose his own officers, and to carry on the war just as he thought best. He also promised that, in the future, no one should interfere with him. On these terms, Wallenstein again accepted the emperor's offer, and was soon back in the field at the head of an army of 40,000 men. By this time, however, a greater general than even Wallenstein had become the leader of the Protestant forces. This was the famous Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, whose bravery had already been shown on many a bloody field. The two commanders and their armies met near a place called Lutzen, in Saxony, and there a fearful battle was fought. In this battle, Gustavus lost his life, but his army fought on nobly and won the day. The victory at Lutzen is always spoken of as the greatest victory of the 30 Years' War. When Wallenstein found that the Protestant army had won the battle in spite of the loss of its commander, he became greatly troubled and scarcely knew what to do. He seemed afraid to meet such an army again. He doubtless saw that it was useless to continue the war, and hoped that the emperor would make terms to the Protestants, and so establish peace. Wallenstein's enemies again appeared before the emperor with the old story that he was simply fighting for himself and was determined to make himself ruler over the entire nation. Strange as it may seem, the emperor again believed them. He went so far as to call Wallenstein a traitor, and he caused him to be publicly disgraced and again removed from command. With a guard of about 1,000 men, and accompanied by several of his leading officers, Wallenstein left the camp and once more started for his home. He supposed that all who accompanied him were his faithful friends, but it was not so. 4 of the men whom he thus trusted had already agreed to assassinate him. Having first murdered his real friends, they hurried to the house where Wallenstein was staying, broke into his room, and killed him as he was retiring to rest. It is said that, for this shocking crime, the murderers were handsomely rewarded by the emperor. Wallenstein ranks as one of the world's greatest soldiers, rather than as one of its greatest heroes. His work was a hindrance rather than a help to human progress, and this it is which so largely dims his fame. End of Chapter 12. Read by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Chapter 13 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Your reader is Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haran and A. B. Poland. Chapter 13. Gustavus Adolphus, 1594 to 1632. In the year 1594, a child was born in the royal palace of Stockholm who was destined to have great influence upon the history of modern Europe. He was the son of Charles IX, King of Sweden, and was a grandson of the famous hero Gustavus Vasa. He was given the name of Gustavus Adolphus. As soon as he was old enough to begin his education, he was provided with the best of teachers. He soon learned to speak Latin, Greek, German, Dutch, French, and Italian. But before he was 18, his studies were brought to an end by the death of his father. He was at once proclaimed King of Sweden. Gustavus had been carefully instructed in athletics, especially in riding, fencing, and military drill. He was a boy of muscle as well as of mind, and he soon proved the value of both. At the time of his father's death, Sweden was at war with Denmark. The Danes had captured the 2 most important fortresses of Sweden. Gustavus was determined to win them back, and he continued the war with great vigor. A few months after his accession, the Danes sent a fleet of 36 ships against Stockholm, but Gustavus, marching night and day, led his army to a point from which he could attack the Danish fleet with advantage. A storm also hindered the Danes from landing, and they returned home disappointed. When the King of Denmark heard of these rapid marches and found that he had no mere boy to contend with, he consented to a treaty of peace by which Sweden regained one of her fortresses and was permitted to buy back the other. From 1614 to 1617, Gustavus was at war with Russia to recover the pay due to Swedish soldiers which his father had sent to Russia a few years before. In that war he took from Russia the 2 provinces of Karelia and Ingria. These provinces remained in the possession of Sweden for more than 100 years, serving as a great barrier between Russia and the Baltic Sea. Even the land on which St. Petersburg now stands passed into the hands of the Swedes, and at the close of the war, Gustavus declared, "The enemy cannot now launch a boat on the Baltic without our permission." When Gustavus came to the throne, Sweden was at war also with Poland. The cause of the war was this: Charles IX, the father of Gustavus, was not the true heir to the Swedish crown. It belonged by right to Sigismund, King of Poland. Sigismund had tried to take the crown of Sweden from Charles, and he now tried to take it from Gustavus. But Gustavus won a great victory over Sigismund and forced him to abandon his claim to the throne and to make peace, which was of great advantage to Sweden. 10 years before the birth of Gustavus, a new star had suddenly appeared in the northern skies of Europe, and people thought that wonders in the heavens had much to do with the events upon the earth. The new star rapidly became one of the brightest in the firmament. It could be seen by men with keen eyes even in the daytime. But it soon began to lose its brilliancy, and in about a year and a half it disappeared entirely. When Gustavus Adolphus startled Europe by his brilliant victories over Denmark, Russia, and Poland, men began to believe that the wonderful star foreshadowed the wonderful boy king of Sweden. Some, however, began to speak of him as the Snow King, and declared that he would soon melt. Finally, they came to think of him rather as one of the old Scandinavian war gods, and they found that he was equal to greater tasks than those he had already accomplished. The Empire of Germany was, at that time, divided against itself. The 30 Years' War was raging. The grain fields were trampled down by marching troops. Towns were besieged and burned. Innocent people were destroyed by thousands. Two great generals, Wallenstein and Tilly, were filling the empire with horrors. In 1631, the city of Magdeburg was taken by Tilly. Its little garrison of 2,400 men had made a noble defense, but Tilly had no respect for their bravery. As soon as the city fell into his hands, he put these brave soldiers to death, and during the next 2 days his soldiers pillaged the city and slaughtered more than 20,000 of the inhabitants. All Europe was horrified. Gustavus Adolphus gathered an army of 13,000 chosen men and at once invaded Saxony. On the outskirts of the little town of Breitenfeld, not far from Leipzig, Gustavus met the inhuman Tilly and defeated him in battle. The people of Saxony were wild with delight. They gladly opened the gates of their cities to welcome the conqueror of the dreaded Tilly. Thousands flocked to the standard of Gustavus, and his army was soon more than 4 times as large as when he had left Sweden. With this large body of fresh troops at his command, Gustavus determined to follow the German army which had retreated into Bavaria. Having overtaken the Germans, he at once put his army into line and began the attack. In the desperate battle which ensued, Tilly was mortally wounded, and he died as he was being carried from the field. It was at this time that the emperor recalled Wallenstein and again placed him in command of the German army, as we have read in the previous story. It was not long before Gustavus and Wallenstein found themselves face to face upon the field of combat. They met in battle near Lutzen, in Saxony, to which place Gustavus had returned on account of the large number of Saxons in his army. During the morning a thick fog hung over the field, and the fighting did not begin until nearly noon. Then, as the skies cleared, the king and his army approached the German lines singing Luther's beautiful hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." As they ceased singing, Gustavus waved his sword above his head and cried, "Forward, in God's name!" and the battle began. In one particular, Gustavus was most imprudent. A wound, received some time before, made it painful for him to wear a breastplate, and so he led his troops into the engagement wearing a common riding coat. Early in the afternoon, his arm was pierced by a ball from a pistol, and this probably severed an artery. For a time he concealed his wound and continued to encourage his men, but he grew faint from loss of blood, and finally said to one of the princes riding near him, "Cousin, lead me out of this tumult. I am hurt." As they turned, a musket ball struck the king in the back, and he fell to the ground, dying. Some of Wallenstein's men rode up and inquired his name. "I am Sweden's king," he replied. "I am sealing the religion and the liberty of the German nation with my blood." When the troops of Gustavus learned of his death, they attacked the enemy with such fury that Wallenstein was quickly defeated, and Gustavus won the battle, although he lost his life. Suddenly, the star in the north had become the most brilliant in the heavens, and as suddenly its light was quenched. The Snow King had melted at last. But a great work had been done. Gustavus and his brave band of Swedes had inspired half a continent with hope and courage. His splendid victories also did much to crush the tyrannical power of Germany, and the good which this great man accomplished has had much to do with the spreading of religious liberty over Europe. After the battle was over, and just as twilight was gathering, the body of the hero was carried into the little church nearby and laid before the altar. The soldiers, still dressed in their armor, were the chief mourners, and a village schoolmaster read the simple service for the dead. Next morning the body was embalmed, and the soldiers carried it back to Stockholm. There it was laid to rest in the church of Riddarholm, which contains the royal tombs, and where many others of the greatest and best men of Sweden are buried. End of Chapter 13. Read by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York.
Chapter 14 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Heron and A. B. Poland. Chapter 14. Cardinal Richelieu, 1585 to 1642. While Wallenstein on the one side and Gustavus Adolphus on the other were fighting the battles of the 30 Years' War in Germany, a similar religious war was going on in France. Louis XIII and his famous Prime Minister Richelieu were fighting with the Huguenots, or Protestants, of France. Louis sat on the throne, but the real ruler of France was Cardinal Richelieu. The full name of the cardinal was Armand de Richelieu, Richelieu being the name of his father's estate, upon which, in 1585, Armand was born. When he was 22 he entered the ministry and soon became a bishop. His people were mostly poor, and Richelieu felt that there was a grander career before him than to remain their bishop. He determined to make something of himself, and to be the equal of any nobleman in the kingdom. There was only one way in which he could do this. That was by becoming a politician. His ambition was to become a leader of men. In Richelieu's time there was an assembly in France called the States General. It was composed of delegates who represented the nobles, the clergy, and the commons, the three great classes into which the nation was divided. But the States General had no real power. It did not, like our Congress, make laws. It could only petition the king. The delegates presented addresses to His Majesty, telling him of any trouble in the kingdom and begging him to remedy it. Richelieu, being a bishop, was a member of the States General, and although he was one of the youngest, perhaps the very youngest of the bishops, he got himself chosen as the orator who should deliver the address of the clergy. This gave him a good opportunity to win the favour of Louis XIII's mother, the famous Marie de Medici, who was acting as regent of the kingdom until Louis should come of age. The young orator could not say enough in her praise, and she naturally took a liking to him. About a year after his oration at the meeting of the States General, Richelieu was invited by the Queen Mother to become a member of the Council of State. He remained in the council, however, only a short time, for a quarrel arose between the king and his mother, and Richelieu retired from office. Soon, however, the death of Luynes, a favourite minister of Louis, gave him the opportunity to return to Paris. He again took a position under the king, and became the most valuable officer that Louis ever had. When Henry of Navarre granted the Huguenots the celebrated Edict of Nantes, the French people generally hoped that the religious troubles in France were forever ended. But unfortunately this was not the case. In 1621 some of the Huguenots held a great meeting at La Rochelle, which was their richest city, and there made a kind of declaration of independence. The King of France had several fortresses in that part of the country. One of these, called St. Louis, commanded La Rochelle. King Louis considered that he had a right to maintain fortresses anywhere in France, but the Huguenots insisted that the fortress of St. Louis should be demolished. The king, instead of pulling it down, made it stronger. The Huguenots then did a very unwise thing. In 1622 they rose in a general revolt, and made an attack on some of the king's war vessels and captured them. Richelieu, however, managed to put down the revolt. 2 years later the English made war upon France, and again the Huguenots revolted. Richelieu then declared that their power must be destroyed. So, with an army of 25,000 men he marched to La Rochelle and besieged it. The city was well protected. On the land side were vast swamps through which an army could neither march nor drag siege guns. An attack might have been made by sea, but at that time the king had no navy. To prevent food being taken into the city across the marches was easy, but the only way to prevent its going in by ships was to close the harbour. To do this, a great stone dike, a mile long, was built across the channel that led to the city. Richelieu paid his men twice ordinary wages, and in that way, although it was winter, he succeeded in getting the work done. The harbour was thus practically closed. Food soon became scarce, and great suffering prevailed in La Rochelle. But no one thought of surrender. The women were just as determined to hold out as were the men. Months passed, and still the siege went on. The starving citizens hoped every day to see an English fleet come to their aid, and an English fleet did come. When the English commander learned of the great dike that Richelieu had built, he was afraid to approach it lest his ships should be wrecked. He therefore sailed away without firing a gun. At the close of the summer the besieged were obliged to eat horses, dogs, and cats. It is said that they boiled the skins of these animals, and even boiled old leather, trying to make it fit for food. In September a second English fleet attempted to enter the harbour, but by this time Richelieu had equipped a number of large war vessels, and the English met with determined resistance. A storm damaged many of their vessels, and the battered fleet was forced to sail back to England. By this time one half of the population had died, and of those left few were strong enough to do military duty. At length, after a siege of 15 months, La Rochelle surrendered, and the king made a triumphal entry into the city. The fortifications were destroyed, and the power of the Huguenot nobles was forever at an end. Richelieu compelled the nobles to admit that Louis was master of France. Many of them, however, were extremely angry at the loss of their power, and conspiracies against the life of Richelieu were more than once formed, but he always managed to find out about them and to punish those engaged in them. Many of the conspirators were executed, and thus Richelieu's power was actually increased instead of destroyed. It should be said that though Richelieu destroyed the fortresses of the Huguenots, he was not unfair to them about their religion. They were allowed to worship God according to their own consciences, for he was wise enough to know that people cannot be forced to worship in ways they do not like. While Richelieu wished the King of France to be strong, he wished his neighbour, the Emperor of Germany, to be weak. So, in the same year in which he had broken down the power of the Protestant nobles, he actually gave help to the Protestant princes of Germany, who were fighting against the Emperor just as the Huguenots had fought against King Louis. He not only persuaded the great Gustavus Adolphus to lead his army of Swedes against the Emperor, but he paid large sums of money to him for the support of his troops. Thus the great victories of Gustavus Adolphus, which were so valuable to the German Protestants, were won in part by soldiers paid and fed by Richelieu and the King of France. Richelieu saw that if the Emperor of Germany should overcome the Protestant princes, and make himself head of the whole country, and as absolute as Richelieu had made Louis, Germany would be a more powerful country than France. Then Germany might take to herself some of the territory of France. Richelieu fought the Protestants in France to make France united and strong. He paid and fed the Protestant armies in Germany to keep Germany divided and weak. While Richelieu was Prime Minister of France, the English and Dutch were planting colonies in America, and commerce in fish and furs which were brought from the New World was becoming very active and profitable. Richelieu desired France to be the equal of England as a colonizing and commercial nation. He therefore gave a charter to the Company of New France, as Canada was often called. He granted to the company the sole right to collect furs in America, and the sole right to sell them in France. In return, the company was required within 15 years to land at least 4,000 colonists in Canada. To protect trading vessels from pirates who then infested the seas, to defend the coast of France, and to protect her colonies, Richelieu saw that a navy was required. He created the Navy of France. When Louis XIII came to the throne the country had not a single warship. When he died the French navy consisted of 20 men of war and 80 smaller vessels. Long before Richelieu died he had accomplished the object of his life. He had made the King of France an absolute monarch, and himself as absolute as the king. Wallenstein had desired to accomplish the same thing in Germany, but he had miserably failed. Charles I was attempting to make his power absolute in England, but the English people rebelled against him. Many years after the death of Richelieu, the Tsar, Peter the Great, visited Paris. As he stood before the splendid marble monument of Richelieu, he exclaimed, "Thou great man! I would have given thee one half of my dominions to learn from thee how to govern the other half." End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15. A Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Horan and A. B. Poland. Chapter 15. Galileo, 1564 to 1642. Sometime in the year 1583, repairs were going on in the cathedral of an old Italian city called Pisa, and accidentally a workman had set swinging a great lamp which was suspended from the high roof of the building. People came into the church and knelt for a few minutes to say their prayers, and then went out without noticing that the lamp kept on swinging to and fro. A young man about 18 years of age came into the church. He noticed the swinging lamp, and he also thought that it took just the same time to make each of its swings. With his right hand he clasped his left wrist. He knew that the times between pulse beats are practically equal. So, feeling his pulse and watching the swinging lamp, he was trying to measure the one by the other. The young man who watched the swinging lamp was Galileo, and he found that its motions were equal in duration. Before his time, no pendulum had ever swung in a clock. No clock with a pendulum had been thought of. But after Galileo published his great discovery that pendulums made their swings in equal periods of time, a man named Huygens made a pendulum clock. It was found that pendulums about a yard long make each swing in a second, and so at first clocks were made with pendulums which beat seconds. From Galileo's watching the swinging lamp, all our clocks may fairly be said to have been invented. The father of Galileo hoped that his son would become a physician, but the young man liked to study mathematics, and his father permitted him to follow the bent of his genius. Not long after graduating at the university, and when not quite 25, Galileo was made a professor of physics. He taught his classes about pumps and machinery, why smoke rises in the air, why birds' wings enable them to fly, and why fishes' fins send them through the water. Nobody in Europe, at that time, knew much about such matters. There were no steam engines, no railroad trains were in existence, no steamers were crossing the seas. People knew very little about such simple things as the falling of stones and feathers, and pieces of iron and lead. Even learned men thought that 2 pounds of lead would fall twice as fast as 1 pound, 100 pounds, 100 times as fast, and so on. One day Galileo asked some of his friends to climb with him the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This tower is one of the famous buildings in Europe. The odd thing about it is that it does not stand up straight like the tower or spire of a church, but leans over, as some of our trees do. Some of Galileo's friends stayed at the foot of the tower. Some went to the top. Heavy and light things were carried up and dropped from the summit of the tower, and 1 pound of iron reached the ground at the same instant as did a piece that weighed 10 pounds. While Galileo was professor at Pisa, the people of Europe who watched the heavens saw a new star in the sky. "Have you seen the new star? What do you think it is?" were questions that everybody was asking. Some thought it was only a meteor, but Galileo said, "No, it must be a star, because a meteor would surely be moving, and that star seems still." He gave 3 lectures upon it, and people went by hundreds to hear him. Galileo, like everybody else, could look at the star only with the naked eye. He tried to contrive something that would show both it and the other stars more plainly. He had seen spectacles. His grandfather wore a pair. He had somewhere read that if 2 eyeglasses are placed one above the other, things seen through them will appear nearer and larger. Some bright man in Holland fixed an eyeglass at one end of a tube and another like it at the other end, and so made the first telescope. Galileo had heard about this. He bought a piece of lead pipe and fixed a glass at either end. His telescope magnified only 3 times, but it made things look nearer and larger. He was as pleased with it as a child with a new toy. Wealthy and noble Venetians looked through it with wonder, just as when you look through a microscope at the end of a needle, you are surprised to see how blunt it is. Then Galileo used stronger lenses. His second telescope magnified 8 times, and a third was made which magnified 30 times. He looked at the moon, and he saw what no human being had ever seen before. There are mountains on the moon. He saw their bright tops and the shadows which they threw. Then he looked at the planet Venus. She no longer looked like the other stars, but sometimes she seemed to be round like the full moon, sometimes horned like the old and new moons. With his naked eye, Galileo counted only 6 stars in the Pleiades. People long years before had seen 7, and it was believed that one had been lost. Galileo looked one bright night, and his telescope showed him 40. He looked at the Milky Way, and found that its whiteness is the dim light of millions of stars so far away that they seem as small as the finest dust. He then made a 4th and larger telescope, and turned it upon the farthest away of the known planets. Jupiter, like Venus, seemed no more a star. It was round, like the moon at the full. But another and greater wonder appeared. Close to the edge of Jupiter's disk were 3 tiny stars. 2 were seen on the east side of the planet, and 1 on the west. They were Jupiter's moons. Galileo watched on another night, and found that instead of 3, there were 4. We now know that there are 7. He told the other professors in the university what he had seen, and the news quickly spread. The newly found moons were called planets, just as our own moon was, and so it seemed that Galileo had made the number of planets 11 instead of 7. One of the professors was so angry that he would not even look through the telescope. Another man said, "The head has only 7 openings, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and 1 mouth, and how can there be more than 7 planets?" Galileo had an old friend called Kepler, who was the greatest astronomer then living. Galileo wrote to him, "Oh, my dear Kepler, how I wish we could have one good laugh together. Why are you not here? What shouts of laughter we should have at our glorious folly!" About 60 years before this, Copernicus had printed a book in which he said that the earth was not still, as people thought, but that it was all the time moving round the sun. Galileo did not at first believe this, and said in one of his letters that it was folly. Then he saw that it was probably true, and when he looked through his telescope at the planets, he became certain of it. When people said that the system of Copernicus was contrary to the teaching of the Scriptures, Galileo tried to explain the sense in which the passages in the Bible are to be taken. He was then accused of teaching what would do harm to religion, and was summoned to Rome. His trial took place in 1616, and he promised to give up his opinions concerning the Copernican system. But his enemies still pursued him, and in 1633 Galileo was again accused of heresy and of breaking the promise he had made in 1616. The main part of the charge was that Galileo had denied that God is a personal being, and that miracles are not miracles at all. As to breaking the promise he had made in 1616, Galileo admitted that he had felt proud of his arguments in favor of the Copernican system, and in one of his books he had made out rather a strong case for it. He denied, however, having expressly taught the Copernican system. Unfortunately, Galileo did not tell the truth in thus denying what he had taught, and he was sentenced to an indefinite term of imprisonment. The imprisonment was not severe, although Galileo complained of it. He was to return with an old friend and disciple, but at the end of 6 months he was permitted to return to his home near Florence. His friends were allowed to visit him, but he was not allowed to go outside the gate to visit them. This was sad for him, but sadder still was the loss of his sight, for his eyes had seen more of the glory of the heavens than all the millions of eyes that had ever looked at the stars since the world began. He died in 1642, and his body was interred in the Cathedral of Santa Croce. End of chapter 15.
Chapter number 16, of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Paul Curran in the hills of northern England. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haran and A. B. Poland. Chapter 16. Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. Oliver Cromwell was born in Huntingdon, England, 4 years before the death of Queen Elizabeth and the accession of King James I. His father was a gentleman farmer and cultivated his own land, but he was in comfortable circumstances and able to take excellent care of his family. Oliver is described as being of a wayward and violent temper as a lad. He was cross and masterful, but possessed a large quantity of mirthful energy which showed itself in various forms of mischief. It is said that when only a boy he dreamed that he would become the greatest man in England. The story is also told that once, at school, he took the part of king in a play and placed the crown upon his head himself instead of letting someone else crown him. At college he excelled in Latin and history, especially in the study of the lives of the famous men of Greece and Rome. He was, however, more famed for his skill at football and other rough games than for the study of books. His schooling was given him by Dr. Thomas Beard, a Puritan minister who resided in his native town, and who seems to have taken a great interest in him as a boy. It was from his mother, who is described as a woman of rare vigour and great decision of purpose, that Cromwell derived his remarkable strength of character. At the age of 18 he left college, on the account of the death of his father, and returned home to look after the affairs of the family. At 21 years of age, he was married to Elizabeth Bourchier, daughter of a London merchant, who proved to be a most excellent wife. The esteem in which he was held in Huntingdon is shown by the fact that in the great Parliament, which drew up the Petition of Rights, he sat as a member and represented his native town. He made his first speech in the House of Commons, where so much of his future work was to be done, on February 11th, 1629. He was then 30 years of age. A gentleman who heard this first speech has thus described it: "I came into the House of Commons one morning, and listened to a gentleman speaking whom I knew not. His dress was a plain cloth suit, which showed the cut of a country tailor. His linen was not very clean, his hat was without a hatband, his voice was sharp, and his eloquence full of fervour. He was speaking on behalf of a servant, who had been imprisoned for speaking against the Queen, because she indulged in dancing. After King Charles dismissed that Parliament, he decided to manage the affairs of the nation without one, and so for 11 years no other Parliament was called. During this long interval Cromwell remained at home and worked upon his land. Want of money at last forced King Charles to call a Parliament, and it assembled in 1640. In this Parliament Cromwell sat as the member for Cambridge, and took an active part in the business of the House. Trouble soon arose between the King and the Parliament on the question as to who possessed the right to levy taxes. Both parties claimed this right, and neither would yield. Then Parliament passed what was called the Great Remonstrance, which was a complaint from the people of the wrongs they suffered under the rule of Charles. On leaving the house that day, Cromwell said to a friend with whom he was walking, "If the remonstrance had been rejected, I would have left England never to have set my foot upon her shores again." The king was so angry that he ordered the arrest of the 5 members who had taken the lead in the passing of the remonstrance, but the House of Commons would not allow the arrests to be made. The next day King Charles brought 400 soldiers with him, and demanded that the men be given up, but the members would not yield, and the king had to go away without them. It at once became evident that there would be war between the Parliament and the king, and the whole land was filled with excitement and alarm. How Cromwell felt about this matter can be seen from a few words in a letter written at this time. He said, "The king's heart has been hardened. He will not listen to reason. The sword must be drawn. I feel myself urged to carry forward this work." The whole nation quickly became divided into 2 parties. The friends of the king were called Royalists or Cavaliers. Those of Parliament were called Roundheads. Cromwell's own uncle and cousin were staunch friends of King Charles and at once entered his army. Cromwell raised 2 companies of volunteers. He distinguished himself by his strict discipline, although up to the time when the war broke out he had not had much experience in military affairs. He was then 43 years old. He soon became known as a great leader and soldier, and his successes as a soldier gave him a high place in the affairs of the nation. The adherents of Parliament had on their side the navy, and they also had more money than King Charles had, but Charles had a fine body of cavalry, and many of the rich men of England sent him money to carry on the war. At the opening of the war, the army of Charles had the advantage. Cromwell saw that the forces of the Parliament would soon be beaten, unless they could get soldiers who were interested in the cause for which they were fighting, and such men he at once began to gather about him. A large number of soldiers who fought under Cromwell were Puritans. The Puritans were people who objected to many of the forms and ceremonies of the Church of England. Many of them laid great stress on the importance of sober and righteous living. When in camp, they read the Bible and sang psalms. They often recited Bible verses and sang psalms as they went into battle. The first battle of the war was fought at Edge Hill. The greatest loss in any single engagement was at the Battle of Marston Moor, where the King's army left 40,000 slain upon the field. In this battle, the soldiers under the command of Cromwell really won the victory. From that time he rose rapidly until he became commander-in-chief. He is said to have been victorious in every battle he fought. Oliver received while in the army the name of Ironsides, and a little later this same title was given to his men, because the royalist troops had found it impossible to break Cromwell's lines. But it must not be thought that Cromwell was a man devoid of tender feeling. Shortly before the Battle of Marston Moor, his eldest son was killed. Cromwell felt his loss most keenly, and was heard to say, "It went to my heart like a dagger." Indeed it did. Over 60 other battles were fought, and finally the cause of the king was wrecked at the Great Battle of Naseby in 1645. But instead of admitting that he was beaten, and agreeing to meet the demands of the people, Charles fled to Scotland and tried to induce the Scots to give him aid. This turned Cromwell against the king, and convinced him that only through the death of Charles was it possible to secure the liberties of the English people. In June 1647, the king was seized by one of Cromwell's soldiers and placed in custody of the army. The Commons resented this action and resolved to make terms with the king, whereupon the army leaders sent Colonel Pride with a body of soldiers to purge the Commons of members who favoured making terms with the king. The remaining members soon afterwards passed a resolution that the king should be brought to justice, and voted to form a special High Court of Justice. The king protested that the court was illegal and refused to make any plea. He was condemned by the court and was beheaded on January 30th, 1649. In 1653, Cromwell decided to dissolve Parliament. A body of soldiers drove the members out, and Cromwell himself took possession of the Speaker's mace. Oliver Cromwell was now the most powerful man in England, and the army, over which he still presided, offered to make him king. One of his daughters pleaded so earnestly with him that he refused to accept the crown or to take the title of king. England was declared to be no longer a monarchy, but a commonwealth, and under this new form of government, Oliver Cromwell was made ruler with the title of Protector. In the summer of 1658, he was taken ill with chills and fever, and on September the 3rd of that year, he died. Oliver Cromwell had grave faults, and he was by no means an easy man to deal with. he made many blunders, some of which were serious ones, but he proved himself equal to the task he had undertaken. End of chapter 16.